Hi, folks. My name is Cam, and I am the co host of the Pro Life Guys podcast. And I'm super excited to join you today to share a little bit about how you can be an effective pro life ambassador. As much of the world waits with bated breath for the outcome of the Supreme Court case to talk about overturning Roe versus Wade, it is more important than ever that pro lifers are capable of having compassionate and compelling conversations about abortion. And so let's do just that. Let's start by thinking about what it means to be an effective pro life ambassador. And I'd like to borrow from pro life leader Greg Kokel, who lays out three core tools of how we can be effective ambassadors. We can start by thinking of having a good character, empathizing with those around us, and understanding this is a complicated and heavy topic for many people alive in America. Not only that, but we need to have a prepared mind to intellectually engage effectively with the information that's being presented to us. And lastly, we need to have the wisdom to be able to discern how to effectively respond, bearing in mind the knowledge we have and the importance of empathy to effectively meet the person we're talking to where they're at and be able to find solutions for the hard situations that so many mothers and fathers are faced with. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what this means. If we look at what it means to be a person of good character, it's important that we consider the fact that we need to love people genuinely, regardless of the choices that they've made in their life, regardless of past decisions or even complicated situations that they might be faced with, regardless of what somebody has chosen in the past. We need to empathize while not compromising the truth. We need to genuinely love them and want the best for them and for their child. And that means helping them navigate what it is that they're facing. Not only that, but we need to be able to seek to understand where they're coming from so that not only can we present logical and meaningful arguments for how they can navigate their challenging pregnancies, but based on the foundation of where they are starting from, helping them understand the value of human life at all stages of development, regardless of our age. And lastly, through that, we can present a different perspective. We can understand that problems demand solutions, and yet the solutions that we need to be choosing from are not simply anything, but only those choices which do not directly and intentionally harm the weakest, most vulnerable members of the human family. Bearing all of this in mind, this is the lens that we want to approach all of our conversations about abortion with. And how do we navigate the different circumstances that may come up in conversation? Well, we want people to accept the pro life worldview. We want them to understand that all humans should get human rights and that human life begins at the moment of fertilization. That is the anchor of our conversation, talking about the humanity of preborn children. And yet, for many conversations, we're going to need to start by bridging the gap, by meeting people where they're at and helping them process the hard situations that mothers and fathers can be faced with. And while these steps can often lead towards an acceptance of the pro life worldview, at times we'll also have to be able to talk about why all humans deserve human rights. We'll have to talk about the personhood of preborn children and not simply the biology of preborn children. So, how do we do that? Let's dive into how this roadmap may play out in real life. And let's start with that first step of bridging the gap. When we think of bridging the gap, we often think about three core steps for how we can effectively empathize, connect with, and redirect the conversation towards the question at the very heart, the humanity of the preborn. We want to first start by building common ground, helping them understand this is not a me versus you conflict, but rather a let's work together, identifying a common problem, working towards a common solution that will not directly and intentionally harm an innocent human. Let's demonstrate the fact that we understand that pregnancy is not always easy, that there can often be incredible complications and challenges relationally, through circumstances and poverty and countless other components that make pregnancy a daunting and seemingly impossible challenge for so many in our country. As we consider that, we can demonstrate a principle that we do not kill innocent humans to solve even the most challenging of problems. And finally, pivot with the question of if we're not willing to kill born children when their parents are faced with hard situations, why are we willing to kill preborn children when they are faced with the same problems and challenges? And so let's look at how that plays out in reality. Let's look at a circumstance like poverty, something which impacts so many people, hundreds of millions of people in America every day. And let's consider somebody who suggests, I think abortion should be allowed when a mother is struggling with poverty, when she doesn't know where her next meal is going to come from, let alone how she will put food on the plate for a child. What we can do and what we must do is start by finding common ground. I agree with you that it would be incredibly challenging for a mother to be faced with poverty and find out that she was pregnant. I can only imagine what that would be like. From there, we can demonstrate a principle in how we can and how we cannot respond to that hard circumstance. We can ask an analogy. Imagine if a mother with a born child, a 2-year-old child, were faced with poverty. Maybe she recently lost her job, her boyfriend or husband walked down on her, and she didn't know how she was going to pay the rent. She didn't know how she was going to buy groceries that week. Would we ever suggest that she kills her 2-year-old child to cope with the poverty she's facing? Obviously not. And yet, by asking that question, we demonstrate the principle that we do not kill innocent humans to solve even the most challenging of problems. From there, we pivot to the question that brings us to the humanity of the preborn. We ask the question, if we're not willing to kill a 2-year-old child when their mother is faced with dire poverty, why are we willing to kill an innocent preborn child? What is the difference? That is going to be met by a whole range of answers, but it brings us to the heart of the conversation. Do we acknowledge the scientific fact that human life begins at fertilization? And if so, why do we not treat those humans as we do any other human? And so this is just one example of how to navigate hard circumstances that mothers and fathers can be faced with. And there's countless others. And yet when you are confronted with these very real, very harrowing and challenging circumstances that demand solutions, let's approach them with that similar technique of finding common ground, making an analogy to demonstrate the principle that we don't kill innocent born children when their parents are faced with hard circumstances, and pivoting to the central question of the abortion conversation. If we're not willing to kill a born child, why a preborn child? What is the difference? We can find this path time and time and time again, drawing us back to the central question of whether or not preborn children, human embryos, fetuses, and even zygotes, are living members of the human family. Some of you might say, okay, so I've done that, but I get challenged with, but they're not human. That's exactly what we want to talk about, believe it or not, as pro-lifers, because that, as we've talked about, is the anchor of the abortion conversation. If abortion does not kill an innocent human being, then no justification for abortion is necessary. And yet, if abortion does kill an innocent human being, then no justification for abortion is sufficient. So let's talk about the humanity of preborn children. The first thing that we can do is we can appeal to the experts. We can appeal to the experts and we can ask very basic questions that will allow us to demonstrate the common sense answer that human life begins at fertilization. We can start, first of all, by clarifying, can we agree that all humans should get human rights? This is something the vast majority of Americans thankfully do agree with, that regardless of your race, skin color, religious affiliation, gender, or even gender identity, you deserve the fundamental human right to not be killed. From there, we can ask two core scientific questions that are very simple and very common sense to help people understand that even preborn children are living members of the species who deserve human rights. First, we can ask, if something is growing, isn't it alive? Even something growing from 1 cell to 2 cell to 4 cells is growing. And dead things don't grow. Living organisms exhibit growth. Obviously, not all organisms, living organisms, are growing, but those that are, that is a very simple, very accessible indicator of life. And that can lead into the next natural question. If that living organism has human parents, isn't he or she a living member of the human species? And so, even from 1 cell, 2 cell, 4 cells, early in pregnancy, we know that we have a living organism. And if their parents are human, it must be a living human organism. Therefore, isn't abortion a human rights violation, an act which directly and intentionally kills that living organism who has human parents? Doesn't that violate the fundamental human right to not be killed that we agreed upon in the first question? That is a very common sense approach, and we can gain backup, as it were, from the experts, because nearly every single biologist, embryologist, and human life science expert will acknowledge that human life begins at fertilization. This is something affirmed in your high school textbooks, at all universities level textbooks and colleges, and countless others. You can literally use your smartphone to search, when does human life begin? And all credible answers that you will get will identify fertilization as the beginning of human life. And we can think about our own lives even. How far back can we trace our own life? As an adult, I can trace my life back to when I was a teenager. Before I was a teenager, I was an adolescent. Before I was an adolescent, I was a toddler. And before that, I was an infant. But I didn't pop into existence as an infant. Before I was an infant, I was a human fetus. Before I was a human fetus, I was a human embryo. And before I was a human embryo, I was a human zygote, a single cell living member of the human species. I can trace my genetic code back to that moment, but no further. I cannot say that I was ever a human egg cell or a human sperm cell, because whose genetic code resides in those cells? The woman's and the man's, respectively. Whose genetic code lied within that zygote? Mine. The same genetic code that is in each and every one of my cells now. And what was I doing? I was functioning as a coordinated individual member of the human species from fertilization until now. I can trace my very life back to that moment, and the same can be said for each of you and each of the people that you would interact with. This is how we can know that human life begins at fertilization, and that is when we become members of the human family. And that oftentimes will help people accept the pro-life worldview. That will help people understand that abortion is a human rights violation, because it dramatically, terribly takes the life of the weakest, most vulnerable members of the human family. And because of that, it's an inappropriate solution to even the most challenging of pregnancies, which demand a better, a more appropriate response than killing an innocent human being. As we talked about before, we would never suggest that we cope with the very real, hard circumstances that parents of born children go through on a daily basis by suggesting killing their toddlers, even as a last resort. And yet some of you might encounter conversations in which it's challenged that fine, they're human, but that doesn't make them persons. Sure, they're living members of the human species, but that doesn't make them meaningful persons in view of the law or deserving of human rights. They haven't qualified for that. Where do we go from there? We talk about the personhood of preborn children. And when we look at preborn children, when we ask, what is it that gives humans human rights? Often we can understand that the equation must be simple. If you're human, you deserve human rights. And yet so many in our society have rejected that very simple logic. They have said that is not sufficient to get human rights. It must be more. You must be human plus something else. You must be human plus the ability to survive on your own. You must be human plus the ability to have sentient thoughts or conscious experience, or to be able to breathe on your own or have a heartbeat or something like this. You have to be human plus something else. And when we look at that and we ask the question, why? Why does a preborn child not have a rational mind? Why are they not able to survive on their own? Why are they dependent on their parents? Or why may they not have reached that particular stage of development we realize that this all traces back to how old they are. A 6-week human embryo is not able to survive outside of the mother's womb because of how old they are. They're not able to have rational thoughts because of how old they are. They live within a very particular, very specific environment within their mother's body because of how old they are. And so as we consider that, we understand that abortion is age-based discrimination. We understand that we're saying that you have to be human plus a particular age. And though that might seem appropriate initially, we can put that beside other forms of discrimination, which tragically the human species has perpetrated throughout history. We have discriminated human rights based on our ethnicity, based on our gender, based on our skin color. Tragically, the human species has been terrible at discrimination throughout history and even now. And right now, we are deeming this form of discrimination more appropriate than others, which does not make any sense, particularly when you consider the fact that the victims of past injustices have been able to fight back. They've been able to cry for help, and at times, if necessary, they've been able to run away and flee the violence that was being perpetrated towards them. A preborn child can do none of that. And so this is not only the latest form of discrimination, but in many ways, it is the most radical form of discrimination because we have found the victim that can do absolutely nothing to protect themselves against this violence. We understand that challenging circumstances exist. We understand that problems demand solutions, but we do not answer problems by killing human beings. And so that helps us understand that abortion is age-based discrimination and that basing personhood on an attribute like our age is no better than discriminating for any other arbitrary factor that we have no control over. Our skin color, our religion, our ethnicity, our gender. We don't have control over those, and we cannot discriminate human rights on those. Human rights must begin when the human's life begins. This is the only and most inclusive way of looking at human rights. And that is the foundation upon which this country was built upon. The right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness must go to every member of the human family because we acknowledge that these truths are self-evident, that all men are created equal, that all members of the human family are created equal, and that's how we can navigate conversations about abortion. The vast majority of conversations, you can walk through this very simple roadmap, bridging the gap by meeting people where they're at, finding common ground, making analogies, and asking pivot questions that bring us to the humanity of the preborn. Asking the human rights argument of, can we agree that all humans should get human rights? If something is growing, isn't it alive? And if that living organism has human parents, isn't he or she a living member of the human family? And finally, doesn't that make abortion a human rights violation? Should we be challenged on the development of that child or whether or not they're able to function in the exact same way that you and I can? We can ask, why do those differences exist? Do they not trace back to the age of that child? And if so, how is age-based discrimination superior to other forms of discrimination? Why is it any better to say it's okay to kill a human because of how old they are, an attribute that they have no control over? How is that better than any of the other tragic historic forms of discrimination that we have witnessed throughout the past centuries? That's how we can invite people to understand that while, yes, there are problems we face in society, they demand better solutions than killing the most innocent and weakest and most vulnerable members of our human family. So I hope that will help you in the conversations that you are having with about abortion with your friends, family members, those within your sphere of influence. And I hope that if you have questions, you can learn more, not only through our podcast, the Pro-Life Guys podcast, where we feature people like Lila Rose, Stephanie Gray Connors, and Scott Klusendorf. We have in-depth conversations about how to navigate the very real and very important arguments like the bodily autonomy argument, like the violinist argument, like moral relativism, and countless other important conversations to have around the abortion issue. We want to invite you to better prepare yourself so that as conversations continue to present themselves, as this year of 2022 becomes a lightning rod for abortion conversations in light of the Supreme Court decision that will likely be ruled upon this year, that you are able to give a compassionate and compelling response, defending your pro-life worldview and inviting people to find a better solution to the challenges that so many face in our society. I thank you very much for this, and I hope that you will prayerfully and willingly consider how you can actively be involved in changing minds, saving lives, and transforming our culture in a way that will improve the way we respond to the challenging circumstances so many people are faced with. Thank you very much.